Hey YouTube, this is Ace Pinkster. This is about the Granulizer. The Granulizer is an instrument that's been around FL Studio since the very beginning, and it's probably going to stick around until the end. It has a lot of versatility if you use it properly, and if you don't, it can really mangle up one of your samples. You may want that, you may want. I'm going to talk about three things that the Granulizer does very well, and the reasons that I'm pretty happy to have it as an instrument. The first thing that a Granulizer does very well is real-time pitch shifting. Alright, if we listen to the way a sample, or a sampler, handles this particular sample at normal pitch sounds like this.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
And one octave below sounds like this. Now you're familiar with the way that sounds. It's just like when you put your finger on a record. A Granulizer, on the other hand, at normal sounds like this.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Actually, it doesn't. It sounds a bit better than that. Let me reset this.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
And one octave below sounds like this. Now you should notice that although we changed the pitch, the tempo remained the same. The sample did not become twice as long. We play it one octave higher. Again, the sample is just as long as it should be, even though it's played one octave above. This is one of the Granulizer's most powerful feature. And what we're doing here is we're in fact slicing this sample up into tiny little bits, and we're running a quick pitch shifting algorithm on each of these bits individually. So as long as we play them in the proper timing and the proper sequence, it sounds like we've just pitch shifted our sample, as you heard, without actually shifting the pitch. Now, if this is what you're going to use your Granulizer for, you'll have to become familiar with the four knobs on top. The attack and hold times are going to dictate how each grain comes into play. The grain spacing and the wave spacing determine, respectively, the size of the grain.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
And the wave spacing determines how quickly it's going to place these grains throughout the sample. That is to say, whether it's going to move in increments of a half a percentage across our sample, or whether it's going to move in giant leaps across our sample. Okay? At a very small percentage, like 1 or 2%, you'll get almost a static droning sound out of your sample. It won't sound like the original at all. So you may want to use that, you may not. An interesting thing to note about the grain spacing and the wave spacing is that these two knobs work together on a one-to-one relationship. Alright, remember that, because what that means is that if I set my grain spacing all the way up to 300, if I set my wave spacing all the way up to 300,
excuse me while I whip this out.
Although we might not get our sample sounding the way we want to, it is exactly the right tempo that it should be. If I set it for 50% and I set the grain spacing also for 50%, which is actually on the right side, sounds...
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Sounds a bit strange, but again, it's perfectly in tempo. If I set it for 11 on both sides, yep.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Still perfectly in tempo. So, you can use these two knobs together to sort of achieve a different smoothing of your grain, of your granulizing. If it turns out a bit too rough or too metallic sounding, too electronic sounding, you may want to play around with the attack knobs and hold knobs as well. So, one-to-one relationship. Remember that. Down here in the effects, we have some effects that we can run on our individual grains. The panning introduces left to right separation.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Which is a bit disorienting. The FX depth and speed, what they're going to do is sort of introduce a bit of a jitter, a bit of a curve to your grain spacing, so your sample might sound like this.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Or,
excuse me while I whip this out.
You know, it'll be slightly random. That's what...
Excuse me while I...
That's what grain, or rather, that's what the effects do. They sort of create a bit of randomness to it. Equally, the randomize feature here, the fourth knob in our effects panel. It's a percentage-based feature, and what this means is if it's at 15%, as it is now, 15% of the grains will be chosen from random spots throughout our sample. Alright, sounds like this.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
And at 100%, it's complete chaos. Alright, transients is a bit of a hard one to explain. Transients has to do with consonant sounds. If you try to stretch someone who's singing E, that's really easy. But when someone says a word, or even a very simple word like so, it comes out like right. Transients, it's the detect feature will attempt to sense those harsh changes throughout our sample, and what it will do is try to elongate the grains around the front or the back of the sample to try to do away with or minimize that consonant stuttering. Alright, it doesn't always work. And it works a lot better if you have regions marked, if you use a program like Acid or Recycle to create this sample. It might work a lot better for you. And of course the time is just a sample start feature. Lets you choose what position what position
Excuse me while I whip this out.
What position in our sample from the beginning where we're going to start playing. Quite simple. Keep in mind the wave spacing goes from 300 to negative 300, and in the negatives we're actually playing our sample in reverse. Cool. The granulizer is sample based. It takes whatever input you give it, and all of the sample features, such as the resampling, which in the sampler is a static feature, and the granulizer you can still use for a bit of an initial offset, and as well all of the insert envelopes will work just as well in the granulizer, but instead of affecting the grain, they apply to the whole envelope. So they actually work pretty well. They very nicely complement our grain smoothing over here. And to introduce a bit of randomness, you can always throw in some LFOs on the cut or the res or pitch or whatever have you. That's all I got. The granulizer is pretty simple. It's basically a sampler with a different generation algorithm and a couple of extra knobs to let you tweak the way it sounds. But overall, it's pretty much a pitch shifter. If I didn't really mention the other two things, did I? The second thing that a granulizer is good for is stretching out a sample to infinity. And this works not only with voice, but it works really well if you have a very short sample. Maybe you have a sample of a violin or a guitar picking that you really like and you want to stretch it out, to fill an entire pattern. The granulizer is good for that because you can really tweak how it gets cut and how it gets smooth, and you can make it sound quite natural or synthetic if that's what you want. The third thing a granulizer is good for is really chopping up a sample. As you heard with the randomize feature, it's pretty chaotic, but you can get a bit of a more controlled sound by putting an LFO on the wave spacing, for example. Play it backwards. Play it forwards, play it backwards, play it forwards, and stuff like that. A bit hard to control on the grain spacing, but you might find a way to do it. This has been a granulizer tutorial by Ace Pinkter, and this is all I have to say about it. Good night, everybody. Thanks for watching. Ace Pinkter out.